Hello everyone, happy Wednesday, or not so happy as the case may be. Um, this evening, mostly I'm going to be talking about the protests in the US, but first I'll just go over a quick comment that I got on one of my videos. I figure it's a good way to respond to YouTube comments, sort of in person on screen, and this person made a good input. So this was on my post-mortem on discussion with Destiny, and they're essentially saying that, so I think something you did that probably got people to engage less with the tendency to slowly on-ramp your ideas, that is, make your arguments by saying, if you think X then Y, if Y then Z, if Z then my point literally verbatim. And they're essentially critiquing here my tendency to use the kind of academic or essay style of telling them what you're going to tell them, telling them, and then telling them what you told them. So, you have the introduction where you explain your general point and how you'll demonstrate it. You have the body where you lay out all of the individual components of the point, and then you have the conclusion where you kind of sum it up and go over the overall impact of your points. Which, yeah, as he's saying here, or as they're saying here, I think having too slick an argument can actually reduce people's tendency to believe the argument because the person feels like they're being tricked into the conclusion instead of undergoing the internal discomfort that actually changing your mind necessitates for most people. I think this was clearest when you asked Destiny if he really agreed with one of your lines of thought, and initially he said yes, but then eventually opened up and some mostly no. So I think this really difficult issue that I probably could have done a better job of, and probably could have presented the same overall argument with the same points in a way that would have maybe given him a little bit more chance to respond or a little bit more to disagree with, um, or made the overall argument a bit tighter and just gotten more into the weeds in sort of specific areas. So yeah, I thought this was a good take and one that I'll take on board in the future. Uh, with that said, as I mentioned, the main focus of tonight is going to be on the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and I'm partly talking about this because I was going to have a potential guest on this evening, Sudosia, who's an excellent streamer and has a very entertaining Twitch presence, um, but she's off. So we were going to talk about more light-hearted, kind of far future topics. Um, uh, why am I? Oh fuck. Okay, there we go. I'm live on Twitch now. Thank you. I had clicked the wrong buttons on Restream. Okay, so as I was saying, the main focus of this evening is going to be on the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in the US. I was going to have a conversation with Sudosia, who you should all go and follow. She's very good, about the long-term future and exciting sort of far future sci-fi ideas, but she's off covering the demonstrations in person in the US, and uh, obviously that's a very viable, very valuable use of her time. So I figured I would put some of my energies in to trying to address a few of the issues that have come up over the last couple of days. Um, Obviously, I'm not an expert from an academic perspective in US racial politics or US racial history or any of those kind of issues, and I clearly am not acquainted with the personal experiences, not personally acquainted with the experiences faced by black people in the US or abroad. I've never really experienced any uh, oppression or discrimination or anything like that as a result of my race, which is very fortunate for me, but not so fortunate for the many, many millions of people who all over the world experience this kind of discrimination on a daily basis. So it seems to me, based on my limited understanding of this, that the demonstrations, the protests, even riots, have been kind of inevitable for a while now. Um, there has been a pretty consistent ignoring across most aspects of the US political system of peaceful protests, of very mild protests, like taking a knee during sports games when the national anthem is sung. That seems to be about as mild a public protest as one can implement. And yet, the violence, the systemic violence against black people in the US has not abated. So when voices go unheard, uh, protests, demonstrations, and even violence seem pretty inevitable. But the fact of the matter is, based on what I've been seeing online, which admittedly there are selection biases at play and so forth, but based on what I've been seeing, it seems to be the case that the overwhelming preponderance of the violence is being committed by the police forces, by the security organizations that are supposed to protect and serve the population who employs them ultimately. And what we're really witnessing here is a total failure of leadership on the part of the US government. Um, just looking at this photo op that Trump tried to, or that Trump did commit, the completely peaceful demonstrations near to the White House, which seems like a ideal place for a demonstration if you're dissatisfied with the government's function, with its behavior towards you. Going and seeking redress directly from the government, from the people in charge, is a pretty key option in anything that wants to call itself a democracy or a representative democracy, a republic. Any of these kind of ideals necessitates the ability to seek redress from government. And when this is the response to not only the protesters but the press covering them, the press who are critical for the existence and function of a free society, then something is deeply, deeply wrong. And when this is being undertaken not just for the purposes of law and order and keeping the streets clean or implementing a curfew or anything like that, but when it's done simply so that the person in charge is able to get a photo op in front of a church whose pastor didn't even wasn't even aware of, wasn't even informed about. That seems deeply, deeply concerning. That seems like the kind of thing that occurs in tin pot dictatorships rather than in the world's largest democracy. Did you see the video of the guy kneeling expressing love from the cops who was putting handcuffs? No, I didn't. If you want to link that, I would be interested to see that because it's, I mean, I can't say I'm surprised because we see time and again, and we have been seeing over the last few days in particular, time and time again, people standing peacefully in roads, people sitting on the sidewalk, people kneeling, people engaging in no threatening behavior whatsoever, who are treated like they are imminent threats. Because the thing is, the weapons being used by these cops, they're not completely benign. It's not like less lethal weaponry is completely safe and completely harmless. We're not talking about sci-fi goo guns that shoot a magical foam that immobilizes you but doesn't cause you any harm whatsoever. We're talking about weapons that cause pain and suffering, and in some cases threaten serious permanent injuries or loss of life. If we go back just to see some of the protests occurring, okay, it's not great on this video, but the officers are shooting tear gas, they're shooting, which, as has been pointed out, technically not a gas, it's an aerosolized particulate that causes respiratory distress, but it's colloquially known as tear gas in just about every context, and any semantic bullshit over that is just nonsense. So we've got chemical agents that cause respiratory distress and irritation of the mucous membranes. We've got rubber bullets, which, yes, are encased in rubber, but are still traveling at 100 meters a second plus, and the core is made of steel. It's basically a big steel ball bearing that's covered in a little bit of plasticky rubber material. We've got batons that can cause serious injuries. Again, these are metal tubes, not little light plastic sticks that they're hitting people with. Here we go. There we go. So here's a video that Neon Golden has just sent.
We are all people. All of you are my family. All of you are my family. I love each and every one of you. I cry at night because I feel your pain. I feel the pain. I feel the pain of black people. I feel the pain of white people. I feel the pain of innocent cops. I feel the pain. We're all scared. Black, white, cop, doesn't matter. We're all scared. We're living in fear. You gotta stop living in fear. I am not your enemy. You are not my enemy. We have to share this land no matter what. By the end of the day, we have to share this land no matter what. I'm here for you. I'm here with you. I'm not angry at none of you. I love all of y'all. I don't care if you're 5'2". I don't care if you're a 7-footer. I don't care if you're dark skinned. I don't care if you're light skinned. I don't care if you're white. I know. Mask or not, uniform or not. You are my family, and I love you, and I respect you. And I want to understand y'all. I want to understand all of you. I want to. I deeply want to understand you. I would love to come to your house. I would love to meet your kids. I would love to meet your family. I would love to see the best side of everybody here. This is not the best side of everybody here. I would love to see the best side of everybody here. Then you can change the whole perspective of how you view someone because of their size, because of how you see them in different lights. Someone might have a bad day and you say they're a bad person. No, no, no. We all got bad days. We all got bad days. We gotta stop judging people only on our bad days, because we all have them to some degree. How are you on your good days? Do you want to make a stand? Do you want to make a change? Because if we charge you and you charge us, what is that really doing? What is that really doing?
Come on, what are you doing?
What are you doing?
Fuck you! Fuck you! What the fuck do you do?
Are you fucking kidding me?
For what? For what?
Freedom of speech! No! What are you doing?
That woman yelling at the end has it. Freedom of speech. Even if that guy was saying something horrible, if he were saying, fuck all the police and you motherfuckers all need to, something like that, that would not be a justification for taking him up in handcuffs and marching him away. And okay, he was released later, but this is a complete breakdown, an ongoing breakdown of civil society. And I don't mean that in terms of civil society being nice to each other, just all being okay with everything going on. I mean in terms of the institutions that are supposed to protect people, are supposed to serve them and to improve society, are co-opted by the authoritarian, the totalitarian instincts of the people in government. And that's not at all to say that this isn't coming from the bottom as well. The proportion of racist attitudes among police is significantly higher than in the general populace. The political alignment of police seems to be heavily in favour of the Republicans and of authoritarian attitudes. So there are systemic problems in the police. But in addition, these are orders that are being sent down from the top, and both in terms of explicit orders from Trump, from the Department of Justice, to start rounding people up, to start treating them like suspects, but also the signalling that's been going on for years now of Trump speaking to police unions and saying, well, it's okay, if they get bashed in the head when you're putting them in the squad car, you don't need to worry about roughing them up a bit. These are signals that the police are taking on board. And why wouldn't you? If you're some unionized cop earning pretty good money who gets to stand around in holding a big stick, make you a real man with your riot gear on, your gas masks, why are you not going to start taking a cue from above and thinking that you're more powerful than the general populace, thinking that you have justified authority to rain down on them? And it's something that would be a problem under any president. I'm sure if Clinton were in charge now, if Hillary had been elected, or if we were seeing these demonstrations in a year's time, once hopefully Biden is in charge, the people demonstrating would have just as much justification for being upset. The police, in many cases, would no doubt be acting poorly. But there's a huge difference between having police acting badly and having the voice from up top saying we need restraint, we need to start figuring out how to scale these violent responses to demonstrations back. If we had a competent president on the phone with the governors speaking about how to de-escalate the situation, about how to use minimal force, rather than that, we've got the lunatic in charge who is calling on governors to crack down harder, to use more force, to employ weapons which, as Golden alluded to earlier, the chemical weapons here are the use of tear gas is banned by international treaty for use in war. So specifically, one of the earlier Geneva Weapons Conventions, but more recently the Chemical Weapons Convention of 1993, is here we go. These are the international legal rules governing use of chemical weapons, and tear gas is unambiguously included within these protocols. Now, of course, international law does not hold sway over national actions. It is absolutely legal under US law, and there's nothing that the international community can do in terms of enforcing the Chemical Weapons Convention to stop the United States using chemical weapons on its own citizens. I don't want to overplay what tear gas is, what CS or any of the other irritation agents used by riot police are. It's not like this is sarin or VX. It's not causing huge numbers of deaths, but it is causing a large amount of suffering. And more importantly, it is establishing a norm that using chemical weapons against civilian populations, that using chemical weapons against your own population is acceptable. Last year and coming into this year, the Hong Kong police force and the Chinese Communist Party, who are basically directing their actions, was using a large amount of tear gas as a riot control agent against the people of Hong Kong. And quite rightly, there was widespread international condemnation of that, because we can all see that using massive amounts of tear gas on civilians, causing people to have extremely irritated eyes, respiratory system, coughing, spluttering, feeling pain, feeling distortion, all of these things are horrible effects that should only ever be done when the alternative is lethal force. If the police want to control people's movements, they should be trying to engage them in de-escalatory techniques, and when all else fails, breaking out chemical control agents, when the alternative is people dying because the riot is getting out of hand. And in almost every instance in the US, we're nowhere near that. And even when that does occur, it's got to be used in incredibly restrained manner, focused on individual people or on small groups, not like this, where tear gas is just being launched into a crowd indiscriminately who can't get out. That's not trying to control the movements of a crowd. That's not trying to prevent them from going somewhere that would increase their risk of harm. It's not even preventing them from causing harm to officers or property or anything like that. This is just vicious and punitive, punitive uh, uh, response to legal, to moral, to entirely justifiable protests. And when that's the direction that the biggest, most influential democracy in the world is going in, that's extremely worrying. And I would hope that this is part of the reason why we're seeing demonstrations worldwide, why it's London, Berlin, in Australia, the Netherlands, all across the world, we're seeing people take an interest in this and to express solidarity with the demonstrators and to express disgust at the United States response to the demonstrations. And I want the US to be better. I really do, because we're entering a world of unprecedented technological change, of unprecedented social change, and potentially one where bad actors, where authoritarian regimes like China, like Russia, could develop, particularly China, could develop enough power to start taking over international institutions and start reshaping the world in their own image, in much the way that the United States did over the mid to late 20th century. And for better or worse, the only force that can really stand up to that is the US. The EU might be able to some degree, but the US is still somehow the world leader in preventing widespread damage to the international institutions that keep the world functioning in many ways. Institutions like the WHO, which, had it been more seriously engaged with, had the US been working to counter China's influence on it rather than just discarding it altogether, then maybe the COVID response would have been better. And when the US abdicates leadership both in the international sphere and when it abdicates its moral leadership at home, that damages the case for reasonable, functional, international, liberal institutions. It strengthens the case for authoritarian regimes like China, because when China can point to footage of the US tear gassing its own citizens, when authoritarian strongmen across the world can point to chemical weapons being used against the US population, then it's much harder to stop them using tear gas en masse against civilians. It's much, much harder to stop them using chemical weapons against civilians. And while the US may be currently using comparatively mild chemical weapons, it's not that difficult to imagine authoritarian regimes starting to use this as justification for using more serious chemical weapons. And I don't want the next time that Assad wants to gas a bunch of civilians, I don't want there to be any grounds for umming and ahhing over whether this chemical weapon is kind of equivalent to the tear gassing that the US spread throughout all of its cities in mid 2020. That's not a conversation we should end up having, but it is a conversation we'll have to have if the US continues to bombard its own population like this. And it's not just about the use of chemical weapons or the use of conventional weapons or even the ongoing militarization of the police that's been going for decades and is one of the many reasons we should have stopped the war on drugs fucking years and years ago. But the surveillance that's going to be ramping up has me deeply concerned. So this is recent article from yesterday about the DEA has been given permission by the Justice Department to engage in both surveillance and potentially enforcement of the laws against the demonstrators in the across the United States. So this is what comes from Trump's quick aside. Trump said, I think yesterday, that he's declaring Antifa a terrorist organization. For those who aren't already aware, this is a ludicrous, absurd statement because A, Antifa isn't really an organization. It's like a loose collection of groups, that a flag that people kind of operate under. B, it's an anti-fascist organization, and I would argue probably not deserving of being lumped in with terrorist organizations. But C, there's no way Trump can legally declare a domestic organization as a terrorist organization. He could declare a foreign organization to be, or he could get his SecDef or someone to declare a foreign organization to be a terrorist organization and therefore viable to sanction people who try to fund it. But there's no such thing as designating a domestic terror organization. So it's, as with most of what Trump sends out in executive orders, it's wrong and stupid, but it nonetheless has real effects. And one of those real effects is opening the door for the surveillance, the covert surveillance of the United States population by organizations that probably shouldn't be doing that, and certainly shouldn't be doing that for the purposes of general concerns about potential left-wing extremists coming in and causing all kinds of trouble. Not least because anarchistic and far-left extremists using Antifa-like tactics doesn't reasonably capture most of what's going on here. And so I used to be a libertarian, and one of my kind of big concerns was covert surveillance and FISA and the GCHQ and all of that kind of stuff. NSA, Snowden, all that. And while I wouldn't any longer call myself a libertarian, I think the libertarians have a lot of good points when it comes to the concerning impacts of government surveillance. And I think there's a lot to be said for being worried about powerful technologies in the hands of government, in the hands of anyone, but particularly in the hands of government, even when they do have clear benefits. Now, I wish I saw more libertarians over the last few days making this point, making the point that all of the tools that have been handed to the US government over the past couple of decades, the tools for surveilling suspected terrorists, can very easily be turned against the people who we probably don't want the government surveilling and interfering with. Probably most of you have heard about the fact that in the 60s, the FBI engaged in very, very intensive surveillance of the Black Panthers and of Martin Luther King and basically the whole civil rights movement on the grounds that they might maybe be doing a bit of terroristy stuff, including sending a poison pen letter to Martin Luther King telling him to kill himself. Like, unironically, go look it up, it's ridiculous. And we can generally agree now that that wasn't a very good thing, right? We can generally agree that surveilling Martin Luther King, surveilling Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, probably, not the finest moment in the FBI's history. And now we're seeing potentially much of the same kind of activity, seeing the DEA, the FBI, the US Marshals, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms all getting involved in surveillance in, oh yeah, COINTELPRO. Seriously, look that up. That's fucking wild. Um, we're seeing all of these federal law enforcement organizations get involved and starting to implement surveillance against the political enemies of the president. And so there's a mention here of the Insurrection Act, which in which the president has the authority to deploy the U.S. military for domestic purposes. Last employed in 1992 during the LA riots. The Insurrection Act is interesting, and I would highly recommend checking out this Lawfare podcast on it. I generally would really recommend the Lawfare podcasts, and in it they discuss the fact that the Insurrection Act isn't necessarily totally awful. It's been used for good things before. So, for example, in the uh, uh, during the end of the Jim Crow era, the federal government sent in troops to, I think, Birmingham, Alabama, and a few other places in the South in order to implement federal law and to make sure that segregation was not upheld by the local governments. Now, that was probably a pretty good thing. The local governments, the extreme segregationists in the South at the time, were arguably engaging in insurrection. They were engaging in widespread, organized resistance against the US government, and in this case, something that the US government was trying to do that was very good. So it's not like there's no reason ever to use troops in any kind of law enforcement action. But, and it's a big fucking but, when we're talking about President Trump, who's spoken explicitly about gunning down protesters, about threatening their lives, about murdering them in cold blood, and he's spoken about this with refugees as well. He just has such a fucking excitement boner about the possibility of breaking out military hardware and using it against innocent people. And currently, there's nothing in US law that stops him doing that. And we've got to remember that just because something is legal doesn't mean it's morally justifiable. There's going to be a lot of things that the US government does over the coming days and weeks that are legislatively perfectly fine. They are perfectly within the bounds of the US law. And yet, they are things that people within the US and people abroad should condemn. If and when the US government starts deploying military forces en masse for use against riots, and inevitably against peaceful protesters too, the international community should condemn that in the way that they would condemn the same kind of repression in a developing country, in a dictatorship. Because if we don't, then pretty soon the US is going to become a dictatorship, an authoritarian country. And it might not be with Trump, it might be that it's the next person or the person after that, but by normalizing this kind of behavior, by normalizing this kind of action against one's own populace, we are tacitly accepting that we're headed in the direction of a police state. Now, hopefully, this will blow over somewhat. Hopefully, the administration will gradually back down and will uh, uh, make some kind of concessions, and then we'll get Biden in, and fingers crossed there'll be some actual meaningful reforms. That would be nice. But what really worries me is that things are going to get worse, and military on the streets is a direction that could go in. But uh, there's also this possibility of agitators making things worse. Now, Trump's started blaming, or Trump administration has started blaming left-wing agitators, but and this ABC headline isn't particularly good, because if we look at the actual reports being quoted, so it seems to be the case that the greater threat, according to the Department of Homeland Security, isn't some left-wing anarchists who, let's be honest, you've probably seen them online. These are people who are in it for the LARPing. They'll throw a few bricks, but like how many actual, maybe someone can prove me wrong here, but how many actual dedicated, like hardcore left-wing anarchists who are really going to start firing guns and throwing Molotovs are there in the US? A few, sure. You can find a few extremists in any group, but the DHS, and based on pretty much everything I've seen in the news and read over the last few years, uh, seems to indicate that the greater threat isn't from Antifa radicals, it's from militia groups. And here we go, while the note itself does not use the terms left and right, it defines militia extremists as people who direct violence at the government because they believe it is taking away Americans' freedom and setting up a totalitarian regime. Now, obviously, I'm worried about setting up a totalitarian regime, but the people they're talking about here are the kinds of ones who get dressed up in tactical gear and bring out their AR-15 and, you know, stand in front of courthouses shouting about how they haven't been able to get a haircut for months. You know, the kind of people who can practically point guns in the cops' faces and the cops will just stand there stoically. Like cops should. If we want to see the absolute model of good police response to potentially dangerous protesters, we need to look no further than the COVID protests recently, where you had all of these fucking mall ninja tactical badasses with their rifles going up and being a pretty real clear and present threat. But de-escalation, uh, being the stoic thin blue line that never wavers, all that stuff. Yeah, great, well done, police. You really showed how you can be reasonable there. How about you do it for people who aren't right-wing extremist nut jobs? And the worrying thing is that these right-wing extremist nut jobs might well give the government reason to crack down harder. They might well engage in the kind of accelerationism that results in a actual collapse of society, because that's the goal for some of them. If you haven't looked into accelerationism in detail, I would highly recommend this article. There's a bunch of different articles out there, but essentially it's the idea, and there are left-wing and right-wing accelerationist philosophies, though the right-wing seems to be quite dominant at the moment, at least in terms of actual risk presented. But excuse me, accelerationism is the idea that in order to achieve one's political goals, one needs to let things get worse or even accelerate their getting worse for them to get better later on. So this was attempted during the late 20s and early 30s by the KPD, the German Communist Party in Weimar Germany, pre-Nazi Germany, and they didn't want to ally with the Social Democrats, the SPD, or any of the other relatively moderate groups. Instead, they thought that we should, or that Germany at the time should kind of lean into the Nazi Party because, while it might make things worse, it's all going to collapse, it's all going to come down, and things will get better, and we'll reach a communist utopia. Of course, that didn't work out very well at all, to put it mildly. And this is one of the big problems with accelerationism. Even if you think that whatever your end goal is, once you've accelerated things, is good, it's very, very hard to predict the outcomes of extremely complex social dynamics and the forces of history over the course of several years. The best thing we can do is try to retain a little bit of stability while engaging with the very real problems that people have, rather than trying to increase disorder. And I realise, of course, here that almost everyone watching is probably not going to be an accelerationist and probably not going to be particularly uh, uh, amenable to that kind of view set. But it's a general problem, and it's something that I do see people tempted to engage in various aspects of politics and policy. If you ever think that you want to make things better by making it worse first, have a very, very hard think about what that entails. But I digress from the specific to the general. In the case of these white nationalist accelerationists, I don't think it takes a huge leap of imagination to go from some protests and demonstrations that are peaceful, that get massively over-responded to by the police, and a few extremists with rifles going out and shooting a few police officers, shooting a few protesters, and causing the whole thing to spiral out of control. And already there's been a couple of shootings. I think there were, was it 4 cops shot in uh, oh, it doesn't really matter. I'm not particularly interested in focusing on the police who've been harmed, but it is concerning from the perspective of the possibility of inflaming matters further. And that's not to say there's not a possibility of, a legitimate protester, someone who's actually involved with the movement, going way too far. It's not like any movement is immune from extremists who'll take matters too far. But while that is a possibility, and if it does occur, I think that people on the left shouldn't start trying to pretend that it was impossible or try to deny reality. There just needs to be a clear and concise, we don't support this, but this isn't what the movement is about. Hopefully it won't happen. But what does concern me is the possibility that one of these insane fuckers is going to take matters into their own hands, is going to try to accelerate matters, and is going to cause a hell of a lot of harm. So I honestly just don't know what to say. It's such a fucked situation, and there's no easy way out, and there's so many ways that it can go wrong. This is a very unstable state of affairs, And the problem doesn't lie in the protesters because they've been forced into a situation where they have no other option than to demonstrate. I mean, the only other option is, having an actual civil war is to engaging in widespread violence, and that's something they should not be doing. But there's just no choice when you've demonstrated time and time again that peaceful protest and peaceful resistance doesn't achieve much. It doesn't stop black people being murdered by police, doesn't stop the disproportionate heavy sentencing of black people by police, doesn't stop the fact that people of colour are far more likely to get pulled over, are far more likely to get beaten by police, and more broadly than that, the fact that they are less likely to get accepted for the same job as a white person with identical qualifications, the fact that they are more likely to be working in service industries that are at a higher risk from COVID, so they're more likely to die of coronavirus. All of these massive systemic problems are ones that we need to take seriously, we need to engage with, because the alternative is people rioting, and the alternative is people suffering, and neither of those are good outcomes. And normally on this channel, my goal here is talk about big picture issues. I mean, like really big picture issues. The end of the world, the global poverty, these kind of issues that are almost on another level, or are on another level from the kind of day-to-day political concerns of everyday legislation and whatnot. But the fact is that one of the major existential risks that needs to be discussed more is totalitarian government. And while we are a way away from it in the West, and while the US is not on the brink of becoming a Nazi fascist state overnight, it's heading in that direction, and it's starting to look like the kind of failed state where totalitarianism or mob rule can take over. And in any other country, that would be a bad thing. If that were happening in Brazil, say, vaguely comparable population, within a factor of two or so, similarly, big country with a fair bit of clout on the world stage, if that were happening in Brazil, that would be terrible, real shame, but probably not the kind of thing I would focus on as a kind of main topic on this channel. But the US is a country that has 6,500 active nuclear weapons. It's a country that holds a substantial portion of the world's economy. It's a country that still puts out the plurality of the world's scientific research. Like it or not, the fate of the US is intimately linked with the fate of the world. And if we do see a slide into totalitarianism, that'll be a totalitarian state that not only has 300 million people in it, but also has thousands of nuclear weapons, also has access to the world's most sophisticated biological warfare capability, also has access to vast production opportunities for chemical warfare, and has some of the world's most advanced artificial general intelligence research, which, if we don't manage to value align, is going to be a major problem. So, however you look at it, the US sliding towards authoritarianism, towards a nightmare state, is really fucking bad for humanity's long-term future. So even if you don't really give a shit about the racial politics or the everyday experience of black people in America, you should. But even if you don't, please take this seriously, because long term, the fate of the world could rest on the US not becoming a failed state. So, yeah, that was cheery, but I think I needed to say it, and like I said at the start, I can't add a huge amount from the perspective of uh, any insight into the struggles of black people in the US. I've not experienced much of it firsthand. Sorry, I've experienced none of it firsthand, and I've not experienced much of it in general. Speaking with friends and so forth. I've only heard a few of their stories, so I can't claim great personal insight, and it's not a topic I've researched in enough depth to claim academic insight. But I do have a little bit of insight into the end of the world, into the Chemical Weapons Convention, and into totalitarianism. And all of the signals I'm seeing from the US are very worrying indeed. So please consider this. Yeah, sorry. Please consider this to be a genuinely really important issue. And again, while I normally talk about the kind of um, sorry, just a sec. Uh, while I normally talk about charity in terms of uh, uh, averting existential risk or um, helping the developing world, I did get a interesting email from a newsletter from Vox's Future Imperfect newsletter, and in it they suggest, so these are not kind of fully reviewed effective altruist guaranteed charities, but there is some good reason to believe that a couple of these organizations may have very, very high impact even compared to certain global health interventions. So as a background for people who aren't as familiar with effective altruism, uh, criminal justice reform is among the areas of effective altruism, the cause areas studied by effective altruism, and charities that may give bail interventions, but may provide bail for people, can be very effective because most of that bail goes back into the fund. It's almost always repaid. So your donation to a bail fund is going to get recycled through doing good multiple times. So the Alliance for Safety and Justice is doing some more kind of systemic, broad scale interventions, and then bail funds like the Bronx Freedom Fund are more directly helping people with cash bail. So Strimmer Fixed Score asks, can I ask, why is not voting a tacit endorsement of who wins the election, if you even believe that? Well, it depends on the electoral system, but in the case of the US, you literally have two practical choices. Um, two practical choices who are going to win. There's no chance that Jill Stein or whoever is going to win. Realistically, we can all acknowledge that. Um, and I suppose it becomes a bit different with third parties. So basically, you've got two choices, and if you pick one, but if you vote for Biden, then you are in some way meaningfully impacting the probability of his winning. And even if you're not impacting the probability of his winning very much, say you're living in California or something where he's almost guaranteed to win anyway, you are still adding to his mandate gets into power. So in both instances, whether or not there's a high likelihood of his winning, you are adding to the positive outcomes, assuming we think that Biden is better than Trump, adding to those positive outcomes. By not voting, you're accepting that, even if you're going to vote, by not voting, you're accepting that uh, either there's no difference between the candidates or one of them is better, but you're nonetheless not going to put in the effort to help achieve that outcome. Um, Even if you're going to vote for who wins, well, you don't know who's going to win beforehand, do you? Um, so unless you know who's going to win beforehand, you can't be certain that the person you're going to vote for wins. I suspect a lot of people in 2016 didn't vote for Hillary Clinton because they were very confident that she was going to win, including probably in some swing states, which would have been critical to her winning. Um, so, yeah, I mean, I can't say I've like considered the morality of voting on the margins particularly in depth. Like, if you really, really didn't want to vote for Biden, maybe, if you're in a super, super blue state, it's probably not going to make a huge difference. But I think that's probably a bad norm to set. And at least in this case, the sheer value of Biden winning over Trump is so great that even if there's a very, very minuscule chance of you're meaningfully impacting the election, the expected value of your vote is probably still quite great. So I would say pretty unambiguously, vote for Biden, please. Please, if you're able to vote in the US election, please do, because it's, yeah, yeah, please vote Biden. Yeah, and assuming we can safely predict election outcomes seems like a bad idea. Yeah, absolutely. And actually, this is an important point before I kind of bugger off about predicting election outcomes. Lots of people have a go at 538 and similar like aggregators for not successfully predicting the outcome of the 2016 election. But the issue wasn't so much the polling as the people who were representing the pundits who were representing a say like 20 to 40% chance of Trump winning as a almost 0% chance. It's a misunderstanding of statistics. So even if we get to election night and it says, Biden has a 90% chance of winning according to the 538 tracker or whatever, still vote Biden. Please, please still vote Biden, even if you're really, really confident that he's going to win anyway, because there are so many ways that these measurements can go wrong, and it's unlikely that they all go wrong in the same direction, but it does sometimes happen, and there can be last-minute upsets. Hillary Clinton's email investigation, the fact that Comey came out like days before the November voting date and said, yeah, maybe Clinton did something a little bit wrong. We're not going to prosecute, but a little bit wrong. That quite plausibly swayed the election. We can point to dozens of things that may well have done it, but a small spoiler event like that can have a significant enough effect on enough voters that it changes the outcome. Yes, so do watch my video with Aaron McCall. Aaron McCall is a great, great guy. So shout out first to his Twitter. He's doing some great coverage of the protests at the moment. He's an activist in California, friend of mine, and he's just great stuff at the moment. Great stuff always, and he's got some very good commentary on the whole ongoing Trump Biden thing. He's a little bit left of me, but well, he's probably about where he has been for years. I used to be a fair bit right of where I am now and have kind of slid over. So if the trend continues, he's right where he should be. Um, Probably shouldn't judge our political philosophies by that, but still, yeah, dragged me left. But yeah, I'll just get up his video, my video with him now, um, because I think we had a very productive conversation, and yeah, here we go. Uh, so there's the video, Democratic activist Aaron McCall on beating Trump. He has a lot of very insightful things to say, and we particularly talked about ways that non-US people can contribute to helping make sure that Biden wins, which I think is very valuable and is certainly something that I'm going to try to contribute to how I can. Oh, and you could do texting for Joe as well, so that seems like a good way uh, to get out the support for Joe Biden, even if you don't live in the US. Don't try sending money; that causes all kinds of campaign finance problems, and it's not worth it. But if you can, you know, phone bank, text, write on social media, all of this stuff does help. And I think a lot of American conservatives deep down don't want to be the laughing stock of the world. And I think it's potentially quite a useful messaging strategy to have international people strongly saying, Trump makes you guys look fucking ridiculous. Can you maybe just not? Just 4 years of not? That would be nice. Um, Streamer Fix Score says, I'm not American, but if a conservative ends up refusing to vote, can you say he tacitly supported Trump if Trump wins? Um, no, and I don't think you necessarily. Well, I don't know. The issue with this whole it's kind of an ongoing discussion of whether um, you are tacitly supporting someone if you don't vote, and I think yeah maybe, but the discussion seems to focus a lot around like assigning blame, who's to blame for X outcome, and this was a big thing post 2016 election where everybody wanted to kind of work out what the hell happened. Was okay, so it's the suburbanite mums whose fault it is. No, it's the low information white voters. No, it's the low information black voters who didn't vote. No, it's any election outcome is a hugely multifactorial process that it kind of gets a bit silly, I think, to start trying to explicitly, assign blame to, if Trump wins and a conservative voter didn't vote, was he endorsing Trump? Well, probably not on the margin. If this hypothetical conservative voter definitely would have voted for Trump, and say their car broke down onto the way to the polling place or something, then yeah, probably not. Um, but I think there is possibly some rhetorical value to painting uh, anything but a vote for Biden as some degree of support for Trump. And I'm not, like I say, not sure where I stand morally on that, but on the kind of the ethical question of whether that is tacit support or active support or whatnot. But I think at least rhetorically it might well be useful in some contexts. But yeah, if it were the case that in the counterfactual scenario, the voter would have voted for Trump instead voted for no one, then yeah, okay, it's probably not a reasonable description. Um, but I think the important thing though is to try to make the positive claim that Biden is much better than Trump, and I think that's a very easy claim to make. Even if you're not the biggest Biden fan, there are so many ways in which he's got better policies, he's got a better temperament, he's even if you want to go down the like mental acuity route, Biden seems considerably more there and considerably more capable of executive functioning than Trump is. There are just so many good reasons that I don't think necessarily kind of trying to shame people is always the best route. But sometimes if you're certainly if you're signaling to people on the left who are maybe fairly extreme on the left and are kind of saying, well, Joe Biden does nothing for us. Joe Biden is going to screw everything up just as bad as Trump. So why bother? If they're on the left and the likely outcome of their uh, the two likely outcomes are either they don't vote or spoil their ballot or whatever, or they vote for Biden, and they're choosing the don't vote one, then I think it's a reasonable rhetorical point to say, hey, by not voting not voting here, you are kind of tacitly endorsing Trump. So yeah, I think audience is kind of key. If you are just literally shouting to everyone, maybe not the best strategy to take. Not least because if you're talking to conservatives, you want to point them in the direction of the Lincoln Project. Don't go on about how they're tacitly supporting Trump because they might think that that's not such a terrible thing, or they might have accepted that in order to achieve their greater goals. But oh, here we go. No, that's not the video. Where's their latest video? Oh, here we go. Yeah.
This flag 150 years ago,
Right,
all of this flag 150 years ago knew what it meant. Treason against their country. The death of a United States. America defeated the men who followed that flag. Those with honor surrendered and cast it aside forever. So why does it keep showing up today at events supporting Donald Trump? And why does he call the folks who carry it very fine people?
I think there's blame on both sides, but you also had people that were very fine people.
What does it say that they're all in for Trump? What does it say that he won't condemn a flag of hate, division, and losers? For us, it says this is a time for choosing America or Trump.
See, now, if you want to show something to conservatives, if you want to make the point to them, use something like that. Because you've got, gravelly voice Marlboro man saying real things about real America, and this is how we, achieve our best goals, not go around with those losers who couldn't win a war. And, obviously all of this is kind of a bit, schmaltzy, a bit kind of nationalist and weird. But it's the kind of advert that might actually appeal to people who are on the fence, to people who do like all of those American values and, like maybe their pickup truck and their, insert other stereotypical American thing here, and don't want to be seen as losers. The kind of people who are from the industrial Midwest and might be very sympathetic to a lot of Trump's messages, but are potentially turned off by the very fine people. Because if you look at the polling, things like the very fine people, about Charlottesville, things like Trump threatening to shoot looters in the streets, these are things that poll very badly with everyone who's not in his most fanatical base. And he plays up to them because he thinks he can win on the basis of that base. But it's not necessarily the case. And while Joe Biden's campaign and the DNC have been putting out some pretty solid campaign material, the Lincoln Project has been really targeting those swing voters and those kind of reluctant Republicans, and just knocking it out of the park. So, and it's kind of funny. We've been watching a bit of West Wing recently as some nice kind of escapism. And in one of the episodes, I think it's season 2, they have this big blow up massive concern about this attack ad, this huge, terrible attack ad that's going to hit Bartlett, and the Conservatives are threatening to release it, and it's the most, by modern standards, the most milquetoast. Bartlett isn't a very nice guy. He might do bad things. Oh no, like that's the extent of it. Whereas this is, by the standards of modern attack ads, this isn't too bad. But it's an order of magnitude beyond, what the staff of the West Wing in the TV show were worrying about, and it's a order of magnitude before some of the stuff that Trump comes out with, like literally, accusing competitors of murder, or he did this with what's his name, the MSNBC anchor recently, Joe Scarborough, just literally accusing him of murder. Like no sugarcoating, no like hinting, just Joe Scarborough did a murder. And again, going back to the kind of breakdown of civil order and of institutional norms, when you're accusing journalists of murders that they definitely didn't commit, and when you're sending out your riot police to go and punch journalists in the face and tear gas them so that you can get a photo op, these aren't the actions of a individual who respects institutions, norms, basic rule of law. For someone who ran on law and order, there's decidedly little respect for the law, and right now, decidedly little order. So Neon Golden points to Campaign Zero, which is doing empirically based work. Oh yeah, I saw this actually. This is very, very good. So, again, none of these charities have been deeply researched, so I can't go saying that this is as effective as the Against Malaria Foundation or whatever, but these guys have been doing some very evidence-backed analysis of the protests, of police policy, and each of these is a policy point with all of the research to back it up. And yeah, so join campaignzero.org. Very highly recommended if you want to look at ways that we can actually improve the situation, not just in the US, but in other countries as well, using data-driven, evidence-backed methods. Check them out, and if you've got some money, throw them a few bucks. So, Streamer Fix Score. How do you make the case to 60-year-old white boomers that criminal reform can benefit them beyond morals? It's a good question. I would, for one, point to what's going on right now as pretty strong evidence that if we don't treat people with decency and respect, they're going to start making their grievances heard. And if they make their grievances heard in the current climate, it's going to cause a hell of a lot of disruption because the police shut everywhere down, the police incite riots by escalating violence, and that gets in the way of, driving to fucking Country Kitchen Buffet or whatever and getting your Blue Plate special. That means that you have to get stressed out watching the news about all of these scary riots and stuff going on. I don't think, except for the accelerationists, I don't think anyone likes to see this kind of public breakdown of order. And the danger is that the archetypal 60-year-old white boomer, if you're watching, Mum and Dad, hi, love you. You're not one of these ones, don't worry, you're one of the good ones. But the archetypal 60-year-old white boomer doesn't want to see blood running on the streets, but they can be convinced, or some of them may be convinced, that the reason for all the violence is that, you know, these dangerous looters are going out there and causing all kinds of trouble, and that this needs to be cracked down on. And that's what Nixon tried to do in the 60s to the civil rights movement, is paint them as, you know, dangerous extremists, and they're the ones who are causing a breakdown in law and order. But they need to be made to understand, it needs to be explained to them that the reason for the violence is the actions of the police, both in the acute sense of it's the police who are firing less lethal weapons at um, less lethal weapons at the crowds, and in the chronic sense that the violence against the general populace is giving rise to distrust with the police, and feelings of isolation and feelings of disconnection from society as a whole. Neon Golden here says personal stories which play on emotions can be effective, e.g. if they're big on family, talking about the tragic separation of families when people are wrongfully criminalised. Yeah, I think this is also a very good strategy, because while making the moral argument in the abstract isn't necessarily going to be the thing that persuades them, it's not like 6-year-old white boomers are somehow immune to moral thinking. It's not like they completely lack empathy. It's just that predominantly they're insulated from the consequences of their actions and their preferred policies and so forth, and their media diet is filtered through algorithms and news sites and hosts who shape it in a way that distorts their perceptions. So if we can engage their emotional drive not on empathizing with the one police officer who got a bit of a boo-boo because someone threw a bottle of milk at them, and instead focus on the stories of the far greater number of people who are suffering equivalent or far greater hurt as a result of the actions of the police, then we can use those emotional drives to get people to reach the correct conclusions. And this is something that I don't claim some great expertise in activism, but back in my teens I did quite a lot of demonstration for scientific purposes. And one thing I did learn is the effects of an emotional appeal. And it might not always be the most sort of rigorous way of arguing, and I think one should be willing to back up any kind of emotional appeal with a rigorous and substantive argument, either uh, by oneself or providing a link to, a resource where one can get it. But in a lot of cases, you don't have time or level of shared understanding to engage in a long philosophical diatribe. So you've got to rely on the fact that, you know, while thousands of black people in the US every day are being discriminated against by the police, and probably millions being discriminated, tens of millions being discriminated against in some form every day, sometimes you need to pick on the individual case of, yeah, the tragic separation of this specific family by a black man who was convicted for a trivial crime and was incarcerated due to some 3 strikes law or whatever for an extended period of time, didn't get to see their kids grow up, and I'm probably not the best person to be like presenting these stories. I tend towards the kind of more data driven stuff. But I think it's something I probably need to, as with the whole discussion with Destiny the other day, it's something that I probably need to get better at in general. And if we're collectively people who are interested in, fighting for justice here, fighting for good institutions and for the lack of suffering and for a lack of discrimination, then we've got to be willing to use whatever arguments, as long as they're not fundamentally misleading, whatever arguments are available and are persuasive. So yeah, personal stories, anecdotes, um, explain, the story of a friend who told you about their specific um, experiences uh, with discrimination. Tell them the story of there are lots of charities, lots of groups that are spreading these stories of wrongful conviction, of extremely punitive conviction, of police brutality, and presenting them in a sympathetic way. Um, and yeah, that's another excellent point, Neon Golden. It's um, not just about sort of restoring order by any means necessary, because if you really care about law and order, if you really care about civil society functioning well, you need to rebuild trust. You need to rebuild good community relations so that the response when a police car rolls into the neighborhood isn't, oh shit, it's the cops, let's get out of here, because even if we're not doing anything wrong, they might just decide to shove us over on the sidewalk or take us to the cells for an evening just because they don't like how we look. It's, oh, hey, there's a cop. It's my friendly neighborhood police officer. Let me chat with him and just have a pleasant conversation. Um, and building community relations like that is currently impossible when the police officer you see is a big burly dude who might have a couple of dodgy tattoos under that uniform, maybe has a Pepe tattoo or a little suspicious cross tattoo or something, who is carrying, a mace and a pepper spray and a pistol, and he's got an assault rifle in the car, and even when on duty they've got big bulletproof Kevlar vest on, and if they're on riot patrol, well, gee hot golly, they'll have a whole fucking uh, plate mail armor on made of ceramic and ballistic weave and all of this kind of shit. That's just not the basis for a good tenable relationship. And this is something that is amply demonstrated in social psychology research, is that if you have clothing and presentation of dress and uniform that evokes authority and evokes depersonalization, then surprise, surprise, people are going to view you as less of a human. If you have a line of cops all wearing identical things, all with their faces hidden, with gas masks on, black uniforms, big, bulky, that doesn't look like an individual human who you can have a conversation with. That looks like a stormtrooper. It looks like and I'm not being flippant here, but it looks like the kind of enemy you see in a video game and you shoot at. And there's a reason why video games do that, of course, because it's kind of less fun to be shooting through ranks and ranks of enemies, all of whom have a closely rendered face, who scream about their poor mother as they die or whatever. And in video games, it's designed specifically to dehumanize the enemies. And in the case of police forces, it's doing the same thing, and that's bad for both the protesters and the officers. It's bad for everyone. Um, and I mean, it's effective in some ways for the police because it removes accountability. So if you don't want to be, videotaped beating up someone for no reason, then I guess it can work. But overall, it's not conducive of good, effective long-term policing. It's not conducive of the kind of law and order that people who advocate so strongly for strong police often claim to be so interested in. So, Strimmer fix score here. Do you think police officers would de-escalate from a realised personal mistake mid-traffic stop or whatever if they didn't know they were being filmed? Is ego a problem? It's possible. Uh, I wouldn't be surprised if one or two instances like that would occur. I think on in general, based on the research I've seen, body cams seem to do less than one might expect to improve interactions between officers and the public, which take that as you will. Can't say I've looked into it in huge detail, but my intuition would be that overall it's better to film police and risk them occasionally like getting embarrassed and doing bad things because they're embarrassed than not film them and making it easier for them to abuse their authority. Though I suspect part of the reasons why body cams haven't been hugely impactful is because every time body cam footage comes out of a police officer being abusive, it kind of just gets ignored. They never get prosecuted or hardly ever get meaningfully prosecuted, and it ends up with they have no strong they have no strong incentive to engage in good behavior even though they are being filmed. So it seems plausible, at least, that body cams and generally filming the police is kind of a necessary step to properly enforcing the laws that should be governing them, but not sufficient and plausibly comes with some negative side effects. Um, but yeah, so I think I'll leave it there. Apologies for anyone who was expecting me to have a conversation with someone else this evening. I left it a bit late, and my previous guest slash my being a guest on her show, Sudosia, is currently out covering the protests in person, which is obviously important and valuable. So I wish her the best. I hope that things are going okay with her. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't notice. Streamer Fix Score gave me 100 bits. Thank you very much. That's muchly appreciated. Um, I hope I haven't. Oh, and official Neb TV also hosted me about an hour ago. Thank you very much, Neb TV. I didn't notice at the time. It hasn't shown up on the chat window. I should get one of the notification things that comes up with subscribers and all of that kind of stuff. So I actually get told about it at the proper time. But yes, thank you very much everyone who's being supportive of the channel. It really is tremendously appreciated, and though I uh, mainly do this for the purposes of spreading good memes and doing talking about thank you Steady on 24. I mainly want to talk about good stuff and important matters. It really does mean a lot to me that so many people have been very supportive of what I'm doing. Another quick shout out to Ben Meg, who became my first subscriber last night. If you would like to subscribe, that's appreciated. And if you do have Amazon Prime, it's possible to subscribe for free. You get like one free subscription with Amazon Prime. So if you've got that and haven't subscribed to anyone, consider me. But yeah, okay, well, I'm gonna bugger off now. On Friday, I'm going to be I'm gonna be mixing a margarita live on stream, classic cocktail. I think almost exactly a month late. Yeah, exactly a month late for Cinco de Mayo, which is going to be good. Margarita is one of my favorite drinks. It's an excellent one. So I'll tell you a little bit about history and show you how to mix it up properly. And then I'm probably going to be playing some more New Vegas. So come watch me wander around a post-nuclear wasteland and chat about nuclear war or whatever kind of comes to mind. So thank you very much. Just gonna see if anybody is. Just check it, but just check again and see if anybody's streaming because I want to. Thank you very much. The Heisenberg of alcohol. I like that. That's very kind of you. Uh, thank you. Um, right. None of my favoured channels are streaming. Otherwise, I would do one of those raid things. But for the time being, I will love you and leave you. Thanks a lot. Have a good night, everyone, and I will catch you on Friday, same time, 8 p.m. UK, 3 p.m. US East, midday US West.